Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing my fancy booktube hat, and today I'm bringing you a review of Bitter Greens by Kate Forsyth. This is a novel that I read last month, and it was rich and meaty enough that I thought I absolutely had to do a full review of it. This is primarily a historical fiction novel dealing with the history of the Rapunzel fairy tale. It devolves a bit into historical fantasy. I'll get more into that later. But there are three storylines in this book. The main storyline is the story of Charlotte Rose de la Force. Now, she's an interesting historical figure that Kate Forsyth has put a lot of effort into sort of digging out of obscurity. She was a writer in 17th century France at the court of Louis XIV. And she's credited with writing the story, her version is called Percinet, I think, that was collected by the Brothers Grimm as Rapunzel. We know there was an earlier version of this story from Italy called Petrocinella. Apparently no one has any idea how Charlotte Rose would have known that story. I really want to applaud Kate Forsyth for her research on the life of Charlotte Rose. Apparently there is very little English language scholarship on her, so she actually had to dig up French biographies of this woman, commission translations so that she could learn about her life. At the very start of this book, we meet Charlotte Rose in her, I think, mid-40s, and she has just been banished from court. Louis XIV is displeased with her for some reason, and he's sending her away to a convent. And throughout the book, we end up getting flashbacks that tell us more about her life. While she's there, she meets a nun who ends up telling her this Rapunzel story that happened in Italy a century before, about a girl named Margherita. And this part of the book becomes a full-fledged retelling of the Rapunzel story. The third story is about a girl who comes to be named Selina. She is the witch in the Rapunzel story. She is the daughter of a courtesan. She eventually becomes one herself. Kate Forsyth has cast her as one of the models of the painter Titian in this story. And she eventually, you see how she turns to black magic and sorcery, because in the historical story that we're getting here, the backstory, the Italy story, the Venice story, is a fantasy story, and there is real witchcraft. There is a point in this book where one female character says to another something along the lines of, and I'm paraphrasing, but to survive as a woman in this world, you will have to be one of three things. You have to be a wife, a nun, or a whore. And I think that part of what Kate Forsyth is doing in this book is sort of systematically exposing the historical cruelty of all three of those options. And if you think about it, there are sort of echoes of all three of those roles that a woman might play in the Rapunzel story itself. So this is not a nice book. This isn't a feel-good historical fiction novel or a feel-good fairy tale novel. It's an exploration of some of just the utter impossible futility of women's existences in history. We know that Charlotte Rose wrote this version of Rapunzel while she was walled up in this convent, which is interesting when you think about Rapunzel being about a woman who is walled up. So the second and third stories here, the Rapunzel story and Selina's story, those are real fantasy, and there is real sorcery in those stories. Now there's also a theme of witchcraft happening in the 17th century French story. This was a time period when women didn't have power, and one of the few ways that a woman might conceive of obtaining some sort of control over her own life would be to go to a witch and get a potion or a spell. And there are some fascinating historical incidents that end up being woven into this book in that time period surrounding witchcraft and women who were earning a living professing to be witches. And what's interesting reading this book is the characters believe in it. Charlotte Rose believes at one point that she has purchased a charm with magical power, and it shapes how she sees events, whereas we as readers can see that that's maybe not the case and feel sort of pain for what's really going on here. But there is this essential theme of, if this is the one thing a woman can do to gain some sort of control over her own life, and she could literally burn at the stake for it. Those are incredible stakes. And you sort of see in this book the witch hunting that happens as a manifestation of a male-dominated society being extremely uncomfortable with female power. Another theme in this book is the theme of religion. Charlotte Rose de la Force was a Huguenot. She was not a Catholic. Her family was not a Catholic family. And there's, of course, an immense amount of history about those religious tensions in France, and eventually we know that it comes to Charlotte Rose being sent to a Catholic convent, and she struggles immensely with her family's religion and the religion of the court. This book also, I feel like Kate Forsyth is exhibiting here an immense love of the arts. You get the theater and the music and the paintings of these time periods, and it's all done in a way that enriches your idea of the cultural scene. I think my greatest qualm about this book was the way in which the author ultimately decided to tie up the various storylines. Up until the end of this book, there is a clear division, or there was for me, between what is the historical fiction storyline and how are we supposed to feel about that, and what is the historical fantasy storyline and how we're supposed to feel about that. There is an aspect of how she wraps up this book that dissolves that boundary in a way that is clearly meant to bring unity to the whole story. But I honestly didn't think it was necessary. And for me, it did more harm than good in terms of being able to give credibility to the majority of the story. So that was really my only big qualm with this book. It was slow for me to read, but not in a bad way. It did take a couple weeks for me to get through, though. All in all, I was really impressed with this book, though. I thought it's an incredible feat of historical research and fantasy and fairy tale and feminism. And I would love to know if you've read it, and I would love to know what you thought about it. I'd love to know if you've read any of this author's other books and what you think of them, because this is the first book of hers I've read, and I'm thinking I'll definitely at some point want to pick up some more of her work. Anyways, thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this review. I hope it has been helpful for you in deciding whether or not this might be a book you'd want to read. And that is all. Bye for now.